There are documents that should never be found. Papers that once seen cannot be unseen. Words written in ink that reveal truths so disturbing they change everything you thought you knew about the world around you. This is the story of one such document. A ledger. A simple leather-bound book filled with names, dates, and numbers. The kind of record any plantation might keep to track inventory, expenses, purchases. But this ledger was different. It was hidden, deliberately, carefully. Behind a false panel in a locked desk in a room no one was permitted to enter. And when it was finally discovered on a sweltering August afternoon in 1854, it revealed something far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Something that would put lives in danger. Something that would force people to flee in the dead of night. Something that powerful men would kill to keep secret. Because some lists aren't meant to document what happened. They're meant to document what was done, and to whom. The heat rose from the dirt road in visible waves, distorting the landscape like water over glass. Elias Thorne wiped the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief that had long since become useless, soaked through with the humidity that clung to everything in Louisiana's late summer. The small carriage bounced along the rutted path, its wheels creaking with each jolt, kicking up clouds of dust that settled on his dark wool coat like a second skin. He had been traveling for 3 days. 3 days from Richmond, where he had worked as a bookkeeper for the Carmichael Shipping Company. 3 days to reach this remote corner of Louisiana, where the cypress trees grew so thick that sunlight barely penetrated their canopy, and the air smelled of decay and wet earth. 3 days to reach Belle Rive Plantation. The name meant beautiful dream in French. But as the manor house came into view through the tunnel of ancient oak trees draped with Spanish moss, Elias thought it looked more like something from a fever dream. The once white columns were stained with mildew. Paint peeled from the shutters in long, curling strips. Weeds grew up through the brick pathway that led to the front entrance. This is it. Elias asked the driver, a weathered man who had spoken perhaps 10 words during the entire journey. Belle Rive, the man confirmed, his voice flat. Home of the late Dr. Alastair Dubois. Late. The word hung in the air between them. Dr. Dubois had died 6 weeks ago. A riding accident, according to the letter Elias had received from the estate's attorney. The doctor's horse had thrown him during a morning ride. He'd struck his head on a stone marker at the edge of the property, dead before anyone found him. The estate needed someone to organize the deceased's financial records and prepare an accounting for the heirs. Elias had been recommended by a colleague in Richmond, a man who had worked with Dubois years ago when the doctor still practiced medicine in New Orleans. Quick work, the attorney's letter had promised. 2 weeks at most. The estate will compensate you generously. Elias needed the money. His mother in Richmond required constant medical care, and bookkeeper's wages barely covered her expenses. This job offered 3 months' salary for 2 weeks of work. He couldn't refuse. But as he stepped down from the carriage and felt his boots sink slightly into the soft, damp earth, something coiled tight in his stomach. An instinct, a whisper in his mind that said, "Turn around, leave, get back in that carriage and go home." He ignored it. The front door opened before he could knock. A tall, thin man with sunken cheeks and eyes like chips of slate stood in the doorway. He wore the clothing of an overseer, rough cotton shirt, worn leather vest, boots caked with dried mud. "You the bookkeeper?" the man asked. His voice was rough, like gravel scraping against wood. "Elias Thorne, yes, I'm here to—" "I know why you're here." The man stepped aside, gesturing impatiently for Elias to enter. "Name's Silas Croft. I manage the property. Managed it for Dr. Dubois for 15 years. Elias stepped into the entrance hall. It smelled of mildew and something else. Something sweet and rotten, like fruit left too long in the sun. The wallpaper was peeling. Water stains darkened the ceiling in brown patches. A grand staircase curved up to the second floor, its banister covered in a fine layer of dust. "The doctor's study is upstairs," Croft said, already moving toward the staircase. "Everything you need is in there. Papers, ledgers, correspondence, all of it. What about the household accounts? I'll need to review." "All in the study." Croft's tone made it clear he had no interest in conversation. "I'll have someone bring your trunk up. You'll stay in the East Wing. Meals are at 7 in the morning and 6 in the evening. Don't wander the grounds after dark. The paths are uneven and there are sinkholes near the cypress groves." It sounded like a warning. Elias followed Croft up the stairs. The wood groaned under their weight. As they reached the landing, Elias noticed something odd, a dark stain on the wall about chest height. It looked like something had been removed, a painting perhaps, but the outline was strange, irregular. "What was there?" Elias asked, pointing to the mark. Croft didn't turn around. "Mirror. Broke during the funeral. Bad luck to keep broken mirrors." They continued down a long hallway. Oil lamps hung from the walls, unlit. Even in daylight, the corridor was dim, the windows too few and too small to let in much sun. Doors lined both sides, all closed, all silent. At the end of the hall, Croft stopped before a heavy oak door. He produced a key from his pocket and unlocked it, pushing the door open with a creak. "Doctor's study," he announced. The room was larger than Elias expected. Bookshelves lined 3 walls, packed with leather-bound volumes. A massive desk dominated the center of the space, its surface covered with papers, books, and correspondence. More papers were stacked on the floor. A filing cabinet stood in one corner, its drawers slightly open. The window behind the desk looked out over the back of the property, fields that stretched toward a dark line of trees in the distance. "You'll have privacy here," Croft said. "No one will disturb you." "What about the household staff? I may need to speak with—" "There is no household staff." Croft's voice was sharp. "Not anymore. Dr. Dubois lived alone in his final years. I manage the field operations. That's all that remains." Elias frowned. "But surely there's a cook, a housekeeper." "Meals are brought up from my quarters." Croft was already turning to leave. "Like I said, everything you need is in this room. Do your work and stay out of the way. We'll all be better for it." Before Elias could respond, Croft was gone, his boots echoing down the hallway. Alone in the study, Elias took a slow breath. The air felt heavy, oppressive. He moved to the window and opened it, hoping for a breeze, but the air outside was just as still and thick. He turned back to the desk. Time to begin. The work was exactly what Elias had expected, tedious, meticulous, and time-consuming. Dr. Dubois, it seemed, had been a man of obsessive organization in some areas and complete chaos in others. The plantation's financial records were immaculate. Every expense was logged, every purchase documented. Receipts dating back 20 years were filed chronologically in labeled folders. But his personal correspondence was a disaster. Letters were stuffed into drawers with no apparent system. Some were opened, some weren't. Bills of sale were mixed with personal notes. Medical journals were stacked on top of legal documents. Elias spent the first day simply sorting everything into categories. By evening, his back ached from hunching over the desk. His eyes burned from reading faded handwriting by lamplight. When the knock came at the door announcing dinner, he nearly wept with relief. The meal was brought by a young woman, perhaps 16 or 17, who entered without speaking, set the tray on a small side table, and left immediately. She didn't make eye contact, didn't acknowledge his thanks. The food was simple but adequate. Cornbread, beans, a piece of salted pork. Elias ate mechanically, his mind still turning over what he'd found in the files. The plantation's records showed declining profits over the past decade. Dr. Dubois had sold off portions of the property. The workforce had been reduced significantly. Several structures, a carriage house, a smokehouse, what was labeled as a guest cottage, had been demolished. And there were large, unexplained expenses. Payments to suppliers in New Orleans. No description of what was purchased. Just amounts, some quite substantial. Payments to individuals. No names, just initials. To RC for consultation, $300. To JM for discretion, $500. Discretion. An odd word choice. Elias made notes in his journal, questions to investigate further. As darkness fell completely, the room grew colder despite the summer heat. He lit more lamps, but they seemed only to deepen the shadows in the corners. Around 10 o'clock, he heard it. A sound. Faint. Rhythmic. Thump. 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 He paused, pen hovering over paper, listening. It came from below, or perhaps beside. It was hard to tell in this old house, where sounds seemed to travel through the walls in strange ways. Thump. 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 He rose and moved to the door, opening it into the dark hallway. The lamps had been extinguished. No light came from under any of the other doors. The sound had stopped. He stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence. Then, just as he was about to close the door, creak, the sound of weight on old floorboards, coming from down the hall. "Hello," Elias called out. His voice sounded thin, swallowed by the darkness. No response. He waited, heart beating faster than he liked to admit. Then he heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving away from him, toward the stairs. He grabbed a lamp from the study and stepped into the hallway. "Mr. Croft, is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. Elias moved forward, holding the lamp high. The circle of light pushed back the darkness, but barely. He could see perhaps 10 feet ahead. The rest was shadow. He reached the staircase, looked down into the entrance hall below. Empty. "This is an old house," he said aloud, trying to convince himself. Old houses make noise. But even as he said it, he didn't quite believe it. He returned to the study and closed the door. This time, he locked it. Chapter 3. The Discovery. 3 days into his work, Elias had organized most of the doctor's financial records and was beginning to prepare his report. The estate was solvent, though not prosperous. After debts were settled and the remaining assets sold, the heirs would receive a modest inheritance. But the unexplained expenses nagged at him. He needed to account for every dollar. That was his job. And these payments, hundreds of dollars over the past 5 years, all vaguely described or not described at all, represented a significant portion of the estate's expenditures. He began searching more carefully through the desk drawers, looking for receipts, invoices, any documentation that might explain these transactions. That's when he noticed it. The desk had 3 drawers on each side, 6 total. But when he measured the depth of the drawers against the depth of the desk itself, something was wrong. The bottom right drawer wasn't as deep as it should be. He pulled it out completely, setting it on the floor. The interior of the desk space was lined with wood. He ran his fingers along the back panel and felt it move. Not much. Just a slight give, as if the wood wasn't quite fitted properly. He pressed harder. With a soft click, the panel popped forward about an inch. Elias stared at it, his pulse quickening. A hidden compartment. He pulled the panel free and set it aside. Behind it was a space perhaps 6 inches deep, running the width of the desk. And inside was a book. He lifted it out carefully. It was bound in dark leather, about the size of a standard ledger. The cover was worn, the edges frayed. No title or markings on the outside. He carried it to the desk and opened it. The first page was blank. The second page bore a single line of text in neat, precise handwriting. Private record, A. Dubois, not for external review. Elias turned to the third page and felt the temperature in the room seem to drop. It was a table, columns and rows, organized like any bookkeeper's ledger, but the contents. The first column was labeled name, the second, date of acquisition, the third, age at acquisition, the fourth, initial assessment, the fifth, treatment protocol, the sixth, outcome, the seventh, date of disposition, There were 37 entries, 37 rows, 37 names. Elias's eyes moved down the first column. Cécile, Etienne, Antoine, Josiah, Delphine, Marie-Claire, Baptiste, Simeon, Elara, all first names only. He moved to the second column, dates ranging from 1839 to 1853. The third column, ages from 8 to 41. His hands were shaking as he moved to the fourth column, initial assessment. The first entry for Cécile, age 19, acquired April 1839. Subject presents in good general health, strong constitution, suitable for extended trials, cooperative temperament. The fifth column, treatment protocol. For Cécile. Series A, Protocol 7, 3 cycles. Observation period, 14 months. The sixth column, outcome. Terminated February 1841. Specimen preserved. Detailed notes in Journal 3. Elias felt his stomach turn. Specimen preserved. He forced himself to read the next entry. Etienne, age 23, acquired August 1839. Initial assessment. Subject shows signs of previous malaria infection. Interesting case for recovery trials, resistant to instruction. Treatment protocol. Series B, Protocol 4, single extended trial. Observation, 8 months. Outcome, expired, April 1840. Unusual complications. See Journal 4 for complete documentation. Expired. Elias turned the page, his breath coming shallow. More names, more dates, more clinical descriptions of human beings like they were laboratory animals. Antoine, age 30. Excellent specimen, rare opportunity for cardiac study. Josiah, age 15. Young subject, ideal for developmental protocols. Delphine, age 28. Childbearing age, suitable for maternal response trials. Every single entry ended the same way. Terminated, expired, deceased, disposed. Not one marked as recovered. Not one marked as released. Every single person named in this ledger was dead. And the dates of disposition. Elias checked them against the plantation's financial records. They corresponded exactly to some of those unexplained payments. To RC for consultation, the date matched the death of someone named Baptiste. To JM for discretion, the date matched the death of someone named Simeon. Payments for silence. Payments to dispose of bodies. Payments to keep terrible secrets. Elias closed the ledger, his hands trembling. Dr. Alastair Dubois hadn't been simply a plantation owner. He'd been conducting experiments, medical experiments, on human beings. And this ledger was the record of every single one of his victims. Elias didn't sleep that night. He sat at the desk, the ledger open before him, reading every entry, every name, every terrible clinical description of what had been done to these people. Some entries were brief, others were detailed, referencing external journals that Elias couldn't find in the study. See Journal 8 for daily observations of subjects' response to elevated mercury doses. Refer to Surgical Notes, Volume 2, for complete documentation of procedure. Specimen tissue preserved in formalin. Location, Sanctuary, Shelf 7. The word appeared multiple times. Sanctuary, a location where specimens were kept, where procedures were performed. Elias had explored most of the main house during his first days there. He'd seen the formal rooms on the first floor. Parlor, dining room, drawing room, all dust-covered and unused. He'd walked past closed doors in the upstairs hallways, but he'd never seen anything that looked like a medical facility. Where was the sanctuary? He forced himself to keep reading. Around entry 23, he noticed something. A change in the handwriting. The earlier entries were neat, precise, almost elegant, but starting around 1848, the writing became more hurried, more erratic. Words crossed out and rewritten. Margins filled with additional notes, and the tone changed. The early entries were clinical, detached, terrible, yes, but written with the cold precision of a scientist recording data. The later entries were different, Entry for someone named Gabriel, age 16, acquired March 1851. Subject resists all cooperation, requires significant physical restraint. Initial treatments prove ineffective. Subject's stubbornness is remarkable, almost admirable. Protocol adjusted to test limits of human endurance under sustained duress. This one will break. They all break, eventually. Outcome: expired August 1851. Disappointing results. The strong ones always disappoint. Refer to Journal 14. The words were colder now, more cruel. As if Dubois had stopped seeing these people as subjects and started seeing them as obstacles, challenges, things to break. Entry 31, someone named Ilara, age 33, acquired January 1853. This subject is unusual. She looks at me with such intelligence, such understanding. She knows what is coming. I can see it in her eyes. It makes the work more interesting. Fear without understanding is common, but fear with full comprehension, that is rare. That is valuable data. Treatment protocol: Extended Series D, multiple protocols simultaneously. This one can handle more. Outcome: deceased September 1853. Extensive documentation available. One of the most complete studies to date. Specimen fully preserved. Elias felt sick. These weren't medical treatments. This wasn't research to help anyone. This was torture dressed up in scientific language, and Dubois had done it for 15 years. 37 people, 37 human beings who had suffered and died in this house. No, not in the house. In the sanctuary, wherever that was. Elias knew he couldn't remain in the study any longer. The walls felt like they were closing in. The air was too thick to breathe. He needed to get outside, to think, to decide what to do with this horrifying knowledge. It was barely dawn when he left the house through the kitchen entrance. The morning air was cooler than he expected, though still humid. Mist rose from the ground in thin wisps, hovering over the fields that stretched behind the main house. He walked without direction, just needing to move, to put distance between himself and that ledger locked in the desk drawer upstairs. That's when he saw her. An old woman, thin as a reed, her hair white and pulled back in a cloth wrap. She sat on the steps of a small cabin at the edge of the field, shelling peas into a wooden bowl. She looked up as Elias approached, her eyes sharp despite her age. "You the bookkeeper," she said. Not a question, a statement. "Yes, Elias Thorne. I'm sorry to disturb you. I was just walking off a bad night." She nodded. "I can see it on you. The house does that sometimes. Shows you things that make sleep impossible." Elias stopped, uncertain how to respond. The woman gestured to the step beside her. "Sit if you like. I'm Odette. Been here longer than anyone. Longer than even Mr. Croft, though he likes to pretend otherwise." Elias sat, grateful for human company that didn't feel threatening. "You worked for Dr. Dubois?" "Worked for this plantation before Dubois ever came here." Her hands moved steadily, splitting pea pods with practiced efficiency. "I was here when it belonged to the Beauséjour family. Good people, mostly. The doctor bought it from them in 1838. That's when things started to change." "Change how?" Odette was quiet for a moment. Then, "You seem like a decent man, Mr. Thorne. So I'll tell you plain. Leave here. Finish your accounting as fast as you can and go. Don't ask questions, don't look too deep, just do your work and leave." "Why?" She looked at him directly. "Because some soil is so poisoned that nothing good can grow from it. And this soil," she gestured toward the fields, "this soil has drunk too much suffering. You feel it, don't you? In that study. In those papers you're sorting." Elias felt his throat tighten. "What do you know about the doctor's work?" "I know he was a cruel man who called his cruelty science." Odette's voice was steady, but her eyes held old pain. "I know people came here and never left. I know there's a place on this property where terrible things happened. And I know that even though the doctor is dead, his shadow still hangs over Belle Reve like a curse." "The sanctuary," Elias said quietly. "Do you know where it is?" Odette's hands stopped moving. She looked at him with something between pity and fear. "You found something in the study. A ledger hidden with names, dozens of names." "Lord have mercy," Odette whispered. She set down the bowl and pressed her hands together. "I knew he kept records. Men like him always do. They need to document their sins, like writing them down makes them legitimate. I need to know what happened to these people. The truth." "The truth?" Odette's laugh was bitter. "The truth is they suffered and died. That's the only truth that matters." "But where?" "The ledger mentions a sanctuary, a place where he kept specimens, where he performed procedures. The old infirmary." Odette's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Past the north field, near the cypress grove. It was built before the doctor came, meant to care for the sick during yellow fever season. But Dubois converted it, made it his private workshop. No one was allowed near it. Not even Croft. The doctor kept the only key." Elias felt his chest tighten. "Is it still there?" "Building still standing, far as I know. But you shouldn't go there, Mr. Thorne. You really shouldn't." "I have to. If I'm going to understand what's in that ledger, I need to see." "You need to leave it alone." Odette's voice was suddenly fierce. She gripped his arm with surprising strength. "That place is full of ghosts. Not the kind that rattle chains, but the kind that get inside your head and never leave. I've seen good men go in there and come out changed, hollowed out." "Someone has to know," Elias said. "If I just leave, if I finish my report and go back to Richmond and say nothing, then these people, their deaths mean nothing. They disappeared and no one cared. No one even knew their names beyond what's in that ledger." Odette studied his face for a long moment. Then she released his arm and reached into the pocket of her apron. She pulled out something small and pressed it into his hand. A key. Old, rusted, but intact. "The doctor thought he had the only one," she said. "But the man who built that infirmary gave a spare to the head cook back in the Beauséjour days. That key passed through hands over the years. It found its way to me. Why do you have it?" "Because I knew someday someone would need to bear witness." Her eyes were wet now. "My sister was in that ledger, Mr. Thorne. Her name was Elara. She was taken in the winter of 1853. She told me she was going to the main house to clean, but she never came back. The doctor said she'd run away. He offered a reward for her return. But I knew she hadn't run." Elias remembered the entry. "Elara, age 33, extended series D, deceased. September 1853. Specimen fully preserved." "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Don't be sorry. Bear witness. That's all I ask. Go to that place. See what he did, and then make sure the world knows. Make sure it's not forgotten." She stood, collecting her bowl of peas. Before she walked back into the cabin, she turned back once more. "The sanctuary is locked from the outside. The doctor didn't want anyone wandering in. But he also didn't want anyone to hear what happened inside those walls. It's far from the main house, far from the fields, hidden by trees. When you go, and I can see you will, go at night. Croft patrols during the day. He mustn't see you there." Then she was gone, the cabin door closing softly behind her. Elias looked down at the key in his palm. He knew what he had to do. Elias waited until well after midnight. He'd spent the day forcing himself to continue with the regular accounting work, maintaining the appearance of normalcy. He ate dinner when it was brought. He answered Croft's few terse questions about his progress. He gave no indication that anything had changed. But everything had changed. He'd found additional references in the financial records. Purchases of medical supplies sent to alternate property address. Payments to a medical college in Charleston for specialized equipment. A regular expense labeled simply Maintenance, North Facility, the North Field, where the cypress grove began, where the old infirmary stood, the sanctuary. At midnight, Elias dressed in dark clothing and slipped out of the study. The house was silent. He moved carefully down the stairs, avoiding the steps he'd learned would creak. He exited through the same kitchen door he'd used that morning. Outside, the night was moonless. Clouds covered the stars. The darkness was absolute. He'd brought a shielded lantern, one he'd found in a storage closet, and he opened the shade just enough to see a few feet ahead. The light seemed shockingly bright against the blackness. He moved north, past the main fields. The ground here was uneven, marshy in places. His boots sank into mud. Insects sang in the darkness. Something splashed in the distance, a night bird or an animal in the swamp. After 20 minutes of careful walking, he saw it. A structure darker than the darkness around it. Single story, rectangular, isolated among the cypress trees, their gnarled roots breaking through the ground like skeletal fingers. The old infirmary. As Elias approached, he could see that the building was larger than he'd expected, perhaps 40 feet long, built of brick that had been stained black by years of moisture and moss. The windows were boarded over, the door was heavy wood banded with iron, and it was locked with a padlock that looked far newer than the building itself. Elias pulled out the key Odette had given him. It slid into the lock smoothly, turned with a soft click. The padlock opened. Elias removed it and pushed the door. It resisted at first, swollen from moisture, then gave way with a groan. The smell hit him immediately. Chemicals, decay, something sweet and nauseating underneath it all. He raised the lantern and stepped inside. The main room was larger than he'd expected, with a high ceiling and exposed beams. But it had been transformed into something that looked like a cross between a hospital ward and a workshop. Along one wall, shelves, dozens of them, filled with glass jars and bottles. In the lamplight, Elias could see that many of the jars contained things preserved in liquid, organs perhaps, tissue samples. He forced himself not to look too closely. Along another wall, medical instruments, laid out on a long table like a surgeon's toolkit, scalpels, saws, clamps, devices Elias couldn't even name, all metal and leather straps. In the center of the room, an examination table, metal, with restraints at the corners. Dark stains covered its surface, and beyond that, a desk, papers, books, more of Dubois' meticulous record-keeping. Elias moved to the desk, his stomach churning. The lantern light cast strange shadows on the walls. The papers were organized in folders, each labeled with a name. Cécile, Etienne, Antoine, Josiah, Delphine. The names from the ledger. He opened the first folder, Cécile, and immediately wished he hadn't. It contained daily observations, dated entries describing treatments administered, dosages, physical responses, symptoms, written with the same clinical precision as the ledger, but more detailed, much more detailed. Day 47. Subject shows marked deterioration of motor function. Tremors in hands persistent. Verbal communication increasingly difficult. Continue current protocol. Day 89. Subject non-responsive to external stimuli. Respiration shallow. Reduced protocol to observe natural progression. Day 124. Subject expired at approximately 3 a.m. Performed immediate autopsy. Findings: extensive damage to neurological tissue. Detailed documentation attached. Specimen preserved for long-term study. Elias closed the folder, breathing hard through his mouth to avoid the smell. He opened another. Etienne. More of the same. Clinical observations of suffering. Documentation of pain administered in the name of research. Subject requires significant restraint during procedures. Vocalizations disruptive. Administered sedative. Insufficient dosage. Increased amount. Subject unconscious for 14 hours. Respiratory depression noted but subject recovered. Useful data regarding tolerance levels. Another folder. Antoine. This subject possesses remarkable resilience. Extended trial 7 to 3 weeks despite expectations of terminal outcome by day 12. Cardiovascular system shows unusual adaptation to sustained stress. Fascinating case. Prolonged observation warranted. Elias's hands shook as he set the folders down. This wasn't medicine. This wasn't even research. This was a man satisfying his curiosity by destroying human beings piece by piece, and he'd been doing it for 15 years. In this room, in this horrible place he'd called a sanctuary. Elias forced himself to continue looking, to document what he was seeing. Because if he didn't, if he ran out of here right now and never came back, then Odette's sister and all the others would be forgotten. On the far wall he found more shelves. These held journals, leather-bound volumes numbered sequentially, Journal 1 through Journal 18. He pulled down Journal 14, the one referenced in the ledger entry for Gabriel. He opened it and read by lamplight. It was worse than the folders. It was day-by-day torture described in careful detail, with notes about what worked to cause maximum suffering, what broke a person's will fastest, what kept them alive longest while administering the most pain. This wasn't a doctor conducting research. This was a monster documenting his cruelty. Elias felt rage rising through the nausea. A cold, hard anger that pushed back the fear. These people had suffered, had died, and no one had known. No one had cared. But he knew now, and he could make sure the world knew too. He began gathering documents, the folders, the journals. He found a canvas bag hanging on a hook, probably used to transport supplies, and filled it. He took photographs from the walls, daguerreotypes of the facility in its earlier days before Dubois had converted it. He took a small bottle from one of the shelves, labeled with a chemical formula he didn't recognize, as proof of the supplies stored here. And he took one of the instruments from the table, a scalpel in a leather case, because anyone who saw it would know what kind of work had been done here. When the bag was full, he took one last look around the room, and noticed something he'd missed. A door, in the back corner, partially hidden by one of the shelving units. He moved to it and pulled it open. The smell that rushed out was worse, much worse, formaldehyde and rot. He raised the lantern. It was a small room, perhaps 10 feet square, and it was full of jars, dozens of them, hundreds, all labeled, all containing preserved specimens, cardiac tissue, subject, Antoine, date, March 1842, renal section, subject, Josiah, date, October 1844, neurological sample, subject, Delphine, date, June 1847. An entire wall was dedicated to these preserved pieces of human beings. Trophies, evidence, proof. Elias backed out of the room, pulling the door shut. He'd seen enough, more than enough. He turned to leave, and froze. Through the open front door he saw a light, a lantern, moving toward the building. Someone was coming. Elias doused his lantern immediately, plunging the room into darkness. His heart hammered against his ribs. He gripped the canvas bag tightly and moved quickly to the side of the doorway, pressing himself against the wall. The approaching light grew brighter. Footsteps on soft ground, heavy boots, a voice. "I know someone's in there. Might as well come out." Silas Croft. Elias held his breath. Croft's silhouette appeared in the doorway, backlit by the lantern he carried. The overseer stepped inside, raising the light to illuminate the room. "Place hasn't been opened in 6 weeks," Croft said conversationally. "Not since the doctor died. Lock's been secure this whole time. Until tonight." He moved further into the room, his eyes scanning the shelves, the examination table, the desk. So either a ghost opened that lock, or someone found a key they weren't supposed to have. Elias remained motionless. He was behind Croft now, hidden in shadow. If he could just— "You can't leave without passing by me, Mr. Thorne." Croft turned, and his lantern light swept across Elias's position. "And I can be very patient." Elias stepped forward into the light. No point in hiding anymore. "How did you know I was here?" "I didn't. Not for certain. But I've been watching you. Saw how you looked when you came out of the house this morning. Saw you talking to that old woman. Saw the questions in your eyes." Croft set his lantern on the desk. "And I've seen that look before, on the face of every person who started to understand what happened here." "You knew." Elias's voice was hard. "All of it." what Dubois was doing. I managed the property. The doctor managed his research. We each stayed in our respective domains. His research? Elias felt rage flooding through him again. Is that what you call it? Research? Croft's expression didn't change. I call it what the doctor called it. What I thought about it wasn't my concern. 37 people died in this place, tortured, experimented on like animals. And you knew. I kept the plantation running. That was my job. Your job. Elias laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're an accomplice to murder. Multiple murders. Careful with words like that, Mr. Thorne. Croft's voice dropped lower, more dangerous. You're making accusations you can't prove. I can prove all of it. Elias held up the canvas bag. I have the doctor's records. His journals. Documentation of every experiment, every victim, every death. It's all here. Croft looked at the bag, then back at Elias. Then I suppose we have a problem. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Give me the bag, Croft said. No. Give me the bag, and we can forget this happened. You finish your accounting. You leave in a few days. You never speak about what you saw here. Everyone moves on. People died here. People die everywhere, Mr. Thorne. That's the nature of the world. Not like this. Croft sighed, as if Elias was being unreasonable. What do you think will happen if you take those documents? You think anyone will care? You think anyone will believe a bookkeeper from Richmond over the reputation of Dr. Alistair Dubois, respected physician and landowner? I think the truth speaks for itself. Truth. Croft smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Let me tell you about truth, Mr. Thorne. The doctor was connected. He had friends in New Orleans, in Charleston, in Richmond even. Men of science, men of influence, men who understood the importance of his work. Elias felt cold spreading through his chest. There were others, other doctors, helping him, not helping, collaborating, sharing research, funding studies. The doctor wasn't alone in his pursuits. He was part of a larger effort, a network of men dedicated to advancing medical knowledge through unconventional means. You mean torture? I mean methods that squeamish people wouldn't approve of, but methods that advance human understanding nonetheless. Elias stared at him. You actually believe that? I believe that progress requires sacrifice. The doctor believed it too. And so do the other gentlemen who supported his work. Who are they? Names. Croft laughed. You think I'll tell you? You think I'd give you a list of prominent physicians and academics who could be implicated? Mr. Thorne, you're even more naive than I thought. I'll find them. These documents mention consultations, collaborations, mentions initials, no full names. The doctor was careful about that. Elias thought about the ledger, the cryptic payment records, to RC for consultation, to JM for discretion. Croft was right, there were no names, but there were initials, there were dates, there were references that could be traced. It doesn't matter, Elias said. Even without names, these documents prove what happened here. They prove 37 people were murdered. They prove nothing that will hold up in any court. Croft stepped closer. Think practically, Mr. Thorne. You're a bookkeeper, a man who deals in numbers and accounts. You understand evidence. You understand burden of proof. What do you have? Documents that could be fabricated. Specimens that could be from anyone. No witnesses, no bodies, no proof of identity for any of the names in that ledger. The people who worked here know. The people who worked here are gone, dismissed, scattered. The ones who remain. Croft gestured vaguely toward the fields. They want to keep their positions. They won't testify against a dead man's reputation. They certainly won't testify against living men who could make their lives very difficult. Elias felt the trap closing around him. Croft was methodically destroying any hope of justice. So what now? Elias asked. You take these documents and burn them? Pretend none of this happened? I take those documents and store them somewhere safe, where they can't cause problems for anyone. And you finish your work and leave, and everyone's life continues unchanged, except for the 37 people who died here. They're already dead, Mr. Thorne. Nothing you do will bring them back. But I can make sure they're remembered. I can make sure the world knows what happened. Croft's patience seemed to be wearing thin. You can do nothing, because if you try to make any of this public, you'll destroy your own life in the process. You'll be labeled a fraud, a liar, someone who fabricated evidence to extort money from a dead man's estate. Your reputation will be ruined, your career finished, and your mother in Richmond. Croft paused, letting the threat hang in the air. She relies on your income, doesn't she? For her medical care. Elias felt ice in his veins. I'm not threatening anything, Mr. Thorne. I'm simply pointing out reality. You take those documents and try to expose what you think happened here. You'll be fighting powerful people, people with resources, people who can destroy you. And while you're fighting that losing battle, who takes care of your mother? Elias's hands tightened on the canvas bag. Croft extended his hand. Give me the documents. Walk away. Take care of your mother. Live your life. That's the smart choice. For a long moment, Elias stood there, weighing his options. Everything Croft said was logical, true even. The chances of successfully exposing this conspiracy were slim. The chances of destroying his own life in the attempt were high. The smart choice was to walk away. But then he thought of Odette's sister, Ilara, who had gone to clean the main house and never returned, who had suffered for 9 months in this place before dying. He thought of all the names in that ledger, people who had disappeared, who had been reduced to specimens and data points. He thought of the journals full of documented cruelty, written with pride by a man who believed he was advancing science, and he knew he couldn't walk away. No, Elias said quietly. Croft's expression hardened. You're making a mistake. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. Last chance, Thorne. I said no. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Croft reached into his coat. Elias didn't wait to see what he was reaching for. He threw the lantern from the desk directly at Croft, who stumbled backward, raising his arms to shield his face. The lantern hit the floor and shattered, spilling burning oil across the wooden boards. Fire spread instantly, racing along the old, dry wood. Elias ran. He burst through the door into the darkness, clutching the canvas bag. Behind him, he heard Croft shouting. The light from the spreading fire illuminated the cypress grove in flickering orange. Elias ran south toward the main house. His boots pounded on uneven ground. He nearly fell twice, catching himself on tree trunks that materialized suddenly out of the darkness. Behind him, more shouting. The fire was growing. Croft must have gotten out, because Elias heard his voice calling for help. But Elias didn't stop. He had the documents. He had the proof, and now he had to get off this property before Croft and anyone else came after him. He reached the main house, gasping for breath. Ran up the stairs. The study. He needed his own papers, his journal, his travel documents. He burst into the study and began shoving things into his travel bag, the canvas bag with Dubois' documents, his notes, the ledger still hidden in the desk. He retrieved it, wrapped it in cloth, and packed it carefully. Then he heard footsteps on the stairs. Fast. Multiple people. He grabbed both bags and moved to the window, opened it, looked down. A 15-foot drop to the ground below. He threw the bags out first, heard them hit the soft earth. Then he climbed out, hung from the windowsill, and dropped. He landed hard, rolling, pain shooting through his ankle. But he forced himself up, grabbed the bags, and ran toward the tree line. Behind him, lights appeared in the house, voices shouting. Elias disappeared into the darkness of the cypress grove, moving as fast as his injured ankle would allow. He didn't look back. Chapter 8. The Journey to New Orleans. Elias walked through the night. Every sound made him flinch. Every shadow seemed like pursuit. His ankle throbbed with each step, but he pushed forward, driven by fear and determination in equal measure. By dawn, he had reached a main road. He'd been moving roughly south, using the moss on the trees as a guide. It grew thicker on the north side. An old woodsman's trick his father had taught him years ago. He needed to reach New Orleans, needed to find someone who could help. Someone with influence and resources, someone who couldn't be intimidated or bought off. The question was, who? As he walked along the road, he mentally reviewed everything he knew about New Orleans. He'd been there briefly once, years ago. A bustling port city, diverse, dangerous, but also home to newspapers, lawyers, abolitionists, religious leaders. Someone there would listen. Someone had to. A wagon appeared in the distance, heading south. Elias flagged it down. The driver was an older black man transporting vegetables to market in the city. "Can I ride with you?" Elias asked. "I can pay." The man looked at him, mud-covered, limping, clutching 2 bags like his life depended on them. "You running from something?" "Yes." The man appreciated the honesty. "Get in back." "Cover yourself with the tarp. Don't make noise if we pass anyone." Elias climbed into the wagon bed, nestled between crates of turnips and sweet potatoes. The driver threw a canvas tarp over him. As they moved, Elias felt some of the tension leave his body. For the first time in hours, he wasn't running, wasn't exposed. He allowed himself to rest just for a moment. He must have dozed off because when he next opened his eyes, the sounds had changed. The quiet of rural roads had been replaced by the noise of a city. Voices, wagon wheels on cobblestones, the cry of street vendors. The wagon stopped. The driver pulled back the tarp. "We're here, French Quarter. This is as far as I go." Elias climbed out stiffly. His ankle was swollen, but he could walk. "Thank you. How much?" The driver waved him off. "No charge, but a word of advice. Whatever you're running from, don't stop running until you've put it somewhere safe. Men with secrets don't give up easy." Elias nodded. He watched the wagon roll away, then looked around, getting his bearings. New Orleans. The French Quarter. He needed a lawyer. An abolitionist lawyer who wouldn't be afraid of powerful men. He stopped a well-dressed man on the street. "Excuse me, do you know of any lawyers in the city who work with difficult cases?" The man looked at him with suspicion. "What kind of difficult?" "The kind that involves powerful people doing terrible things." The man studied him for a long moment. Then, "Arthur Beaumont. Office on Royal Street, 3 blocks that way. He's a crusader type. Represents people no one else will represent. But I warn you, he's not cheap." "I don't need cheap. I need someone who won't back down." "Then Beaumont's your man, though God knows why anyone would seek out that much trouble." Elias thanked him and headed in the direction indicated. Royal Street was lined with elegant townhouses, many with ornate iron balconies. He found the address, a narrow 3-story building. A brass plaque beside the door read, "Arthur Beaumont, Attorney at Law." Elias entered. The office was small but well appointed. A young clerk sat at a desk in the front room. "I need to see Mr. Beaumont," Elias said. "It's urgent." The clerk looked him up and down, still mud-covered, disheveled. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I have evidence of multiple murders committed by a prominent Louisiana physician. I think that qualifies as urgent." The clerk's eyes widened. I'll check if he's available." He disappeared through a door. Moments later, he returned with a tall, thin man in his 40s. Arthur Beaumont had sharp eyes and graying hair. He looked at Elias with frank curiosity. "You're the one with evidence of murders?" "Yes, sir. Come with me." Beaumont led Elias into a private office. Bookshelves lined the walls. A large desk was covered with legal documents. Beaumont closed the door and gestured to a chair. "Sit. Tell me everything." Elias did. He spoke for nearly an hour, laying out everything he'd found. The ledger, the sanctuary, the experiments, the documentation, the conspiracy of physicians. Beaumont listened without interrupting. When Elias finished, the lawyer sat back in his chair. "May I see the documents?" Elias opened the canvas bag and began removing items. The ledger, the folders, the journals. He laid them out on the desk. Beaumont spent the next hour reading. His expression grew darker with each page. Finally, he looked up. "This is extraordinary and horrifying. If genuine, and I have no reason to doubt you, this represents systematic torture and murder over the course of 15 years. Can we expose it? Can we bring charges?" Beaumont was quiet for a moment. "Against whom?" "Doctor, Dubois is dead. The people named in this ledger are deceased, and the other physicians who may have been involved. We only have initials, but surely the documentation itself is valuable, incredibly valuable. But understand what we're facing. Dubois was well-connected. He had wealthy friends, powerful friends. If we try to make this public, they'll fight back. They'll claim these documents are fabricated. They'll destroy your credibility. They'll make your life hell. That's what Croft said, too. Croft isn't wrong. He's just betting that you'll choose self-preservation over justice." Beaumont leaned forward. "But here's what Croft doesn't understand about men like me. I've spent my entire career fighting battles I was supposed to lose, and I've won more than I've lost." Elias felt hope kindle in his chest. "You'll help?" "I'll do more than help. I'll make this public in a way that can't be suppressed." Beaumont stood and moved to a filing cabinet. He pulled out a folder. "I have contacts. Journalists who will publish this story. Abolitionists who will use it to demonstrate the horrors of the system that enabled it. Religious leaders who will demand accountability. But you said charges would be difficult. Criminal charges, yes. But there are other forms of justice. Public outrage, historical record, ensuring that what happened is never forgotten, that the victims are named and remembered." Beaumont spread out a map of the United States on his desk. "We need to get you out of Louisiana. Once word spreads that you've taken these documents, people will come looking. Croft, certainly. Possibly others. Where should I go?" "Boston." Beaumont pointed to the map. "I have colleagues there, abolitionists, publishers. You'll be safe in Boston while we build the case, and your story will reach a national audience." "How do I get there?" "Ship. Leaves tomorrow morning." "I'll arrange passage." Beaumont began writing a letter. "This is to my colleague Samuel Harrison. He's expecting a package from me. Confidential documents related to the abolitionist cause. You'll be delivering that package, which means you'll have legitimate business traveling north. Less suspicious." Elias felt overwhelmed. Everything was moving so fast. "What about my mother? In Richmond?" "We'll make arrangements for her care. Once you're settled in Boston, we can have her brought north if necessary. But right now, the priority is getting you and these documents to safety." Beaumont finished the letter, sealed it, and handed it to Elias. "Tonight you stay here. My clerk lives upstairs. He'll make room for you. Tomorrow morning you board the ship. Don't use your real name. I'll provide you with travel documents under a pseudonym. And you? What will you do?" "I'll begin documenting everything in these records, making copies, reaching out to my network. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, the story will be too widespread to suppress." Beaumont extended his hand. "You did the right thing, Mr. Thorne. Coming here, refusing to let this be buried. These people, everyone named in this ledger, they deserve to be remembered. And now they will be." Elias shook his hand, feeling something loosen in his chest. Relief. Hope. He wasn't alone anymore. The ship was called Morning Star, a merchant vessel that ran regular routes between New Orleans and Boston, carrying cotton, tobacco, and manufactured goods. Elias boarded at dawn, using the name on his forged travel documents. William Cooper, traveling north on business for a law firm. He kept his head down, avoided conversation, stayed in his small cabin below deck as much as possible. The documents, The ledger, the journals, everything were hidden in a false-bottom trunk that Beaumont had provided. "If anyone searches your belongings, they'll find ordinary papers," the lawyer had explained. "The real documents are sealed beneath." The voyage took 12 days. 12 days of constant worry. Every time the ship stopped at a port, Mobile, Savannah, Charleston, Elias was convinced that someone would board looking for him, that Croft had somehow tracked him, that the conspiracy of physicians had mobilized to stop the documents from reaching Boston. But nothing happened. The ship sailed north and Elias remained undiscovered. He spent the time reading through the documents again, memorizing details, making notes in a separate journal, a coded record in case the originals were somehow lost. He read about Cecile, who had lasted 14 months before her body finally gave out. About Etienne, whose remarkable resilience had been documented with cold fascination. About Josiah, only 15 years old, subjected to developmental protocols that destroyed him piece by piece. About Delphine, whose maternal response trials were described in terms that made Elias physically ill. About Gabrielle, whose stubbornness had been seen as a challenge to break. About Ilara, Odette's sister, whose intelligence and understanding had made her suffering more interesting to document. 37 people, 37 lives stolen, 37 deaths that no one had mourned because no one had known. Elias made a private vow, there in his tiny cabin, as the ship cut through Atlantic waters. He would make sure every single name was published, every single person would be remembered. They would not be forgotten. On the 11th day, another passenger struck up a conversation with Elias in the dining area. A middle-aged man, well-dressed with friendly eyes. "First time to Boston?" the man asked. Elias nodded, keeping his responses minimal. "Business or pleasure?" "Business, for a law firm." "Ah, legal work, important work, law. Keeps society functioning, keeps people accountable." The man smiled. "Though sometimes I wonder if the powerful ever truly face accountability, don't you?" Something in his tone made Elias look up sharply. The man was watching him with interest. "You have the look of a man carrying something heavy, Mr. Cooper. I recognize that look. I've worn it myself." "I don't know what you mean." "Of course not." The man stood, preparing to leave. "But if you're carrying something important, something that powerful people wouldn't want revealed, then I'll give you the same advice someone once gave me. Don't stop until it's public. Once it's public, it's much harder to suppress." He walked away, leaving Elias unsettled. Who was that man? Did he know something? Or was he just making conversation? Elias returned to his cabin and didn't emerge again except for necessary meals. On the morning of the 12th day, the ship entered Boston Harbor. Elias stood on deck, watching the city materialize through the morning mist. Church spires, brick buildings, the organized chaos of a major port. Safety, he hoped. Once the ship docked, Elias disembarked quickly, carrying his trunk and travel bag. He followed Beaumont's instructions, heading to an address in Beacon Hill, the home of Samuel Harrison. It was an elegant townhouse on a tree-lined street. Elias climbed the steps and knocked. The door opened. A man in his 50s with white hair and a kind face looked at him. "Yes?" "I'm here to deliver a package from Arthur Beaumont, in New Orleans." Recognition flashed in Harrison's eyes. "Come in, quickly." Elias stepped inside. The door closed behind him. Harrison led him to a study lined with books. "You're Elias Thorne. Beaumont told you?" "He sent a telegram. It arrived yesterday." "He said you'd be carrying documents of vital importance, documents that expose systematic atrocities." "Yes, sir." "Let me see them." Elias opened the trunk, revealing the false bottom. He removed the concealed documents and laid them out on Harrison's desk. The older man spent over an hour reading. When he finally looked up, his expression was grim. "This is beyond anything I expected." "The scale of it," The deliberate cruelty, the documentation. He shook his head. Dr. Dubois was a monster, and he had help. Can we make this public? Public? Harrison smiled, but there was steel in it. Mr. Thorne, we're going to do more than make it public. We're going to ensure this story is printed in every abolitionist newspaper in the country. We're going to send copies to religious leaders, politicians, medical societies. We're going to make this impossible to ignore. Won't there be resistance? Enormous resistance. The medical establishment will be embarrassed. Dubois' colleagues will try to discredit us. Powerful people will push back. Harrison leaned forward. But we have something they can't fight. Primary documentation. Written in Dubois' own hand. With details so specific, so verifiable, that denial becomes impossible. He stood and moved to a bookshelf, pulling down a journal. Are you familiar with The Liberator? The abolitionist newspaper? William Lloyd Garrison's paper. I write for it occasionally, and I promise you, Garrison will want this story. He's been documenting the horrors of slavery for years. But this, documentation of medical experiments, of torture disguised as science, this is unprecedented. Harrison began making notes. We'll need to be strategic. We'll release the story in stages. First, the basic facts. Then, more detailed accounts. Then, the names. We'll make sure every person in that ledger is identified and honored. Elias felt emotion welling up. Thank you. Thank you for believing me. I believe the documents, Mr. Thorne. They speak for themselves. Harrison looked at him seriously. But I want you to understand what's coming. Once this is published, your life changes. You'll be famous and infamous. People will want to interview you. Others will want to threaten you. You'll be celebrated as a hero by some and condemned as a liar by others. I just want the truth told. The truth will be told. I promise you that. But truth-telling has consequences. Are you prepared for that? Elias thought about Odette, asking him to bear witness, about Ilara and all the others who had died in silence. Yes, he said. I'm prepared. 3 weeks later, the first article appeared in The Liberator. The headline, The Sanctuary of Horrors, Medical Torture in Louisiana Exposed. It was written by Garrison himself, based on Elias's testimony and the documents he'd brought from Belle Reve. The article described the hidden ledger, the 37 names, the experiments, the deaths. It included direct quotes from Dubois' journals, carefully selected passages that demonstrated the systematic nature of the cruelty without being so graphic that newspapers would refuse to print them. And it named Dr. Alistair Dubois explicitly. The response was immediate and explosive. Within days, the story was picked up by other abolitionist papers, then mainstream newspapers, religious publications, medical journals. Some papers ran it as written. Others added commentary, calling for investigations into similar practices at other plantations. Religious leaders preached sermons about it. Medical societies held emergency meetings. The Dubois family responded with fury. They published letters claiming the documents were forgeries, that Elias was a fraud seeking to extort money, that their father had been a respected physician who had never engaged in any improper practices. But their denials rang hollow, because Garrison and Harrison had been strategic. They hadn't just published claims, they'd published evidence. Photocopies of pages from the ledger, transcriptions of journal entries. Details so specific that they could be verified. And then Harrison played his masterstroke. He reached out to medical colleges where Dubois had studied, to professional organizations where he'd been a member, and he found records of censures, of complaints, of whispered concerns about Dubois' methods. Nothing official, nothing that had ever resulted in real consequences, but enough to show a pattern, to demonstrate that people in positions of authority had known, or at least suspected, that something was wrong with Dr. Alistair Dubois, and had done nothing. Those revelations caused a second wave of outrage. Now it wasn't just about one doctor, it was about a system that had allowed him to operate with impunity. About professional organizations that had looked the other way. About powerful men who had prioritized reputation over justice. 4 weeks after the first article, Elias sat in Harrison's study, reading the latest responses. "Listen to this," Harrison said, holding up a letter. "It's from a physician in Charleston, Dr. Richard Carlisle. He's offering to testify about Dubois' practices. Says he attended a private medical conference in 1850 where Dubois presented some of his findings. He was disturbed by the presentation, but didn't speak up at the time. R.C., Elias said quietly. That's one of the initials in the ledger. Payment to R.C. for consultation." Harrison's eyes widened. "You think Dr. Carlisle was one of the collaborators? Or he's trying to get ahead of the story, offering limited cooperation to avoid deeper investigation? Either way, we have a name now, someone connected to Dubois who can be questioned under oath." Harrison began writing. "I'll forward this to colleagues who practice law in South Carolina. Let's see how cooperative Dr. Carlisle really wants to be." More letters arrived over the following weeks. Some were supportive, some were threats. One letter, anonymous, claimed that Elias had signed his own death warrant, that powerful people didn't forget, that he should watch his back. But other letters were from people who wanted to help, who wanted justice, who wanted to ensure that nothing like this ever happened again. A letter from a former plantation worker in Louisiana. She had worked briefly at Belle Reve in 1851. She remembered the sanctuary, remembered being told never to go near it, remembered hearing sounds from that direction at night, sounds she had tried to forget. She was willing to testify. A letter from a medical supply company in New Orleans. Their records showed purchases made by Dr. Dubois, chemicals, instruments, equipment, all shipped to alternate property location at Belle Reve. Documentation that corroborated the ledger. A letter from an attorney in Richmond, someone who had handled estate business for Dubois years ago. He had found the doctor unsettling, had heard rumors, had chosen not to work with him again. Nothing concrete, but more pieces of a puzzle. Each letter, each piece of evidence, each corroboration made the story stronger, made it harder to dismiss, made it impossible to bury. 6 months after Elias had fled Belle Reve, he sat in a courthouse in Boston, not as a defendant, as a witness. The case wasn't criminal. There was no one left to charge. But it was significant nonetheless. Several families of people who had been enslaved at Belle Reve had filed a civil suit against the Dubois estate, seeking damages. It was a long-shot legal strategy. Slave owners had rarely been held financially accountable for how they treated enslaved people. But this case was different, because the people named in Dubois' ledger hadn't died from disease or accident or even routine cruelty. They had been specifically targeted, deliberately tortured, killed through systematic abuse, and there was documentation proving it. The Dubois family's attorneys argued that the estate shouldn't be held responsible for the actions of a deceased owner, that any claims should have been brought while Dr. Dubois was alive, that the evidence was insufficient to prove the identities of the victims. But Elias testified about finding the ledger, about the sanctuary, about the detailed records. Odette testified about her sister Elara, about how she had disappeared, about how the family had been told she'd run away but had never believed it. Other former workers from Belle Reve testified about the atmosphere of fear, about the locked building near the cypress grove, about the supplies delivered there. The former medical supply company employee testified about the unusual orders from Dr. Dubois, about the specific chemicals and instruments that had no legitimate medical use. And Arthur Beaumont, who had traveled from New Orleans to Boston for the trial, presented document after document, page after page of Dubois' own words, condemning him beyond any doubt. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and found in favor of the plaintiffs. The Dubois estate was ordered to pay damages to the families of the identified victims. It wasn't a large amount. The estate had been sold off, and there was limited money remaining. Each family received perhaps $500, but it wasn't about the money. It was about acknowledgement, about a court of law officially recognizing that these people had existed, had suffered, had been killed, had mattered. When the verdict was read, Odette, sitting in the back of the courtroom, wept. After the trial, Elias remained in Boston. He found work with an accounting firm that specialized in estate settlements. Quiet work, honest work. His mother was brought north, her medical expenses now covered by donations from abolitionist organizations who had rallied around Elias's story. He lived simply, kept his head down, but he continued working with Harrison and Garrison because the story wasn't over. The ledger had contained initials, references to consultations, payments for discretion, and slowly, methodically, they began connecting those initials to real names. Dr. Richard Carlisle in Charleston was just the first. Through old correspondence found in Dubois' papers, they identified 2 more physicians who had attended his presentations, who had shared research, who had expressed interest in his methods. One was a professor at a medical college in Virginia. Another was a retired Army surgeon in Georgia. Both denied any wrongdoing. Both claimed they had simply attended academic conferences. Both insisted they had never participated in any experiments. But letters surfaced, journal entries, references in scientific publications to studies that matched Dubois' work, authored by these men. The evidence was circumstantial, not enough for criminal charges, but enough for public scandal, enough for medical societies to revoke memberships, enough for universities to terminate positions, enough for professional reputations to be destroyed. In 1859, Elias Thorne sat in a library in Boston reading a newly published book. It was titled The Sanctuary, a Chronicle of Medical Atrocity in the American South, written by Samuel Harrison. It told the complete story, from Elias's discovery of the ledger to the trial to the ongoing investigation into Dubois' network of collaborators. But most importantly, it named every single person who had died at Belle Reve. All 37 of them. Not just names from the ledger, full names, researched and documented through records, testimony, genealogical research, Cécile Rousseau, Étienne Beaumont, Antoine Deschamps, Josiah Turner, Delphine Lavigne. Every person was given more than just a name. Harrison had included what he could discover about their lives, where they'd come from, who their families were, what had been lost when they died. They were no longer just entries in a ledger. They were people, remembered, honored. Elias turned to the dedication page for the 37. May you be remembered not for how you died, but for the fact that you lived. And may your suffering bear witness to the necessity of justice, the importance of truth, and the power of one person who refuses to look away. Tears blurred his vision. He closed the book and looked out the library window. It was spring. The trees were blooming. The world continued. But in some small way, it was a different world than it had been 5 years ago. Because 37 people who would have been forgotten were now remembered. And a man who would have gotten away with monstrous crimes had been exposed. It wasn't perfect justice. It never could be. But it was something. And sometimes, Elias had learned, something was enough. In the winter of 1861, as the country tore itself apart over slavery, as the Civil War began to rage, Elias received a letter. It was from Odette. She was still in Louisiana, still living in that small cabin at the edge of what had once been Belle Reve. The plantation had been sold. The new owners had demolished the sanctuary. They'd wanted no connection to its terrible history. But Odette had done something first. She had gone there. In those final days before it was destroyed, she had walked through that awful place one last time, and she had found them, the specimens, the preserved remains, the glass jars with their horrible contents and their neat labels. She had taken them all, every single one, and she had buried them, properly, with prayers, in ground that wasn't poisoned by the man who had destroyed them. She had carved markers, simple stones, with names: Ilara, Cécile, Etienne, Antoine, Josiah, Delphine, all 37. They're at rest now, Odette wrote. Together, remembered, free. Thank you, Mr. Thorne, for bearing witness, for refusing to let them be forgotten. They are at peace, and I can sleep now, knowing that. Elias folded the letter carefully. He thought about that night in the sanctuary, the moment he'd realized what Dubois had done, the decision he'd made to take the documents, to expose the truth. It had cost him 5 years of looking over his shoulder, 5 years of threats, 5 years of being called a liar and a fraud by people who couldn't accept what the evidence so clearly showed. But it had also given him something: purpose, meaning, the knowledge that he had done what was right even when it was hard. He placed Odette's letter in a wooden box where he kept important correspondence, and then he returned to his work. Because there were other stories that needed to be told, other injustices that needed to be exposed, other people whose suffering needed to be witnessed. The world was full of secrets, full of documents that were never supposed to be seen, full of truths that powerful people wanted buried. But Elias Thorne had learned something important in that study at Belle Rive, in that terrible sanctuary, in the months and years that followed. Sometimes one person finding one hidden document is enough to start a chain of events that can't be stopped. Enough to turn silence into acknowledgement. Enough to transform forgotten victims into remembered people. Enough to prove that truth, once brought to light, can never be completely extinguished again. Some lists aren't meant to be found, but when they are, when someone has the courage to look at what's written there, and the determination to make sure the world sees it too, everything changes. The 37 people named in Dr. Alistair Dubois' ledger had suffered, had died, had been reduced to specimens and data points, but they hadn't been forgotten. And in the end, being remembered, being acknowledged, being honored, being mourned, that was its own kind of justice, imperfect, incomplete, but real, and real was enough.